How's it going, Hillary?
Uh, Good. So I'm trying to figure out where to start. I have a lot of updates.
Okay.
Um, since we last spoke, I've done quite a bit of data analysis and modeling, and I've come up with some estimates for both internal load, septic system load updates, waterfowl loading, an update to all watershed sources, an update to background forested watershed sources that are contributing nutrients but are more or less not able to be controlled, as well as atmospheric deposition. Um, I've done a number of exploratory analysis on the historical data that I reorganized to sort of fit the way that I do my data analysis. Um, and I found quite a few interesting things in both the historical and 2023 and 2024 data. I don't know, do you want me to share my screen? Like, how much detail do you guys want right now?
As much as you can bear giving us at this,
Okay.
that's why we're here.
All right, give me a second. Am I able to share my screen here?
Uh,
You should be able to.
Yeah, you
Okay,
should be able
give me a
to.
second.
maybe you could
All
put your
right,
phone on
so
speakerphone so you didn't have to hold it too. I feel bad, but up to you.
yeah, here, give me 1 second. It's hard to hear everybody's voices on my phone speakerphone, but just give me 1 second. All right, I'm gonna start with the internal phosphorus loading model. Um, so this looks like a lot of a lot
Yes,
of
it does.
information. Give me 1 second, and I'm gonna mute my computer.
All right. We may have, I think we,
Um,
oh yeah, there you go. Good.
yeah, okay. I have to hold it for some reason. It's
Uh,
like,
fine. Okay.
yeah, it's okay. So basically, I'll start on the first tab. You guys should be able to see this. I did 3 years of like estimating the area of anoxia, and corresponding volume. I don't know if I'm going to be able to switch back and forth, but I have this other spreadsheet that has what I call a hypsographic curve based on your bathymetry data and corresponding area based on each contour depth. And I plug that into a volumetric model to create basically like the slices of each of the 1 meter depth increments. I plug that back into a series of models to then predict what the depth and volume of specific what the area and volume are of specific depths. And from that, I can do all sorts of things where I can calculate things like the mass of phosphorus in the lake, the potential release rates, and the aerial release of sediment-derived phosphorus. And I can calculate the volumetric oxygen depletion rates. So basically, these estimates are from various years of dissolved oxygen and temperature profiles. And I have estimated that the internal load is probably about 20 to 30% of your total load. Where these right here, if you can see this, are my estimates right now relative to the total. And this might be a little high. So I've gone back and did a little bit more of the lake loading response model, which was what was done in 2015. They were really low for some reason in that report, in the 2015 report, and I didn't catch it until I did more of a deep dive into this loading. This P model is more attuned with the watershed-based planning tool that Mass DEP has in the model that they use for nutrient loading. The 2015 report used the same model that I've used for other pieces of this, but for some reason, they used an attenuation factor of 25%. And I don't know where that came from. So basically, they modeled everything in the watershed in the 2015 report and then like put in an attenuation factor that was lower than I'm used to. So basically, a higher attenuation factor in the model itself would mean that the watershed was not retaining as much.
Hillary, can I ask you a quick checking question? Because
Sure.
it looks like that table we're at right now is the critical one. Is that from your right above the 2023, 24, or did you also average in the town's data from 2020 and 20? So you
I did estimate, yes.
for
So I did
4 years.
estimates for 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024. And the average for the actual aerial load was 23.5 over those 4 years. But you can see the estimate here was pretty low for 2021 and pretty high for 2022, which was the year that you had that larger bloom.
And
but
that was the drought year too. Yeah.
Yeah, but so the interesting thing about this though is that just because these estimates are high doesn't mean that that total mass is actually making its way to the area of the lake where algae are going to be actively growing. So like I would expect based on your profiles from the last 10 years, I would expect that the release of phosphorus is similar in most years. What I found was that in 2022, it was really that your area of anoxia was much greater. So like in the 2022 data, you had oxygen profiles indicating anoxic conditions all the way up to 7 meters, which if you think about the way that a lake is shaped like a bowl, as you go shallower, your area is going to dramatically increase. So if you are having anoxic conditions up to 10 meters, that's a very different scenario than up to 7 meters. This was the only data when you had the bloom that it was this shallow. Let me show you something else. I'm just going to share a different screen here. Okay, so these are some figures. What I think happened in looking at these more detailed for that bloom, trying to hypothesize what actually happened, you have a metallonetic oxygen minimum, and then it increases here in concentration, which I see this sometimes when there's an oxygen debt, either because of density gradients in the water column and decaying organic matter right on top of the thermocline, or sometimes it has to do with a large area with a biological oxygen demand for aquatic plants, which could be like any aquatic plants or mud in the shallow water areas that have an oxygen demand. That it was actually like potentially infiltrating from a shallower depth, and then eventually it all went anoxic. And I see that like infrequently. I would say like maybe 10 times in my career I've seen that pretty pronounced. And it didn't seem to happen in any other years, which is interesting. So I don't know if this had to do with an increase in load due to a watershed event at that time, or some other anomaly in like the wind or rainfall that would cause increased consumption of dissolved oxygen near the bottom of the epilimnion and the top of the thermocline. But I think that it being so shallow compared to other years had pushed the anoxic boundary into the thermocline. And basically you had the lower metalimnion being anoxic, which would increase the availability of those deep water nutrients to cyanobacteria. Interestingly, in 2024, you had a really, really distinct layer of serratium, which is a phytoplankton dinoflagellate that it does vertical migration similar to the cyanobacteria, but it seemed to be taking advantage of the nutrients in a way that cyanobacteria can, but it was outcompeting the cyanobacteria in 2024. So despite the fact that it wasn't quite as much anoxic area, you didn't have an increase here all the way to 7 meters in 2024, but you still had phytoplankton taking advantage of the nutrients in deep water right above the top of the anoxic boundary. There's a couple other things I wanted to show you here. So I was looking to try to figure out in the historical data. I have not looked at weather data from 2022 yet, but the temperature, this is the temperature from 1 to 4 meters. So I'm considering that the epilymnion here. And I was looking to see if there was an increase in early season temperature in the surface waters in 2022 that could have caused stronger stratification, which would have worsened the anoxic conditions. And I didn't see that. So I looked down in the hypolimnetic area, and I do see that the hypolimnetic temperatures were higher earlier in the season and throughout the season in 2022. So that's interesting to note. Basically, that would be if all else was static and you didn't have any dramatic increase in the oxygen debt and the rate of oxygen consumption, the only thing that would have changed was the stratification if it was temperature driven. And that could have in itself prevented, or that could have in itself increased the dissolved oxygen loss, simply because if it was stratified earlier in the season, you have a longer period of time for oxygen loss at a greater depth there. These are some nutrients from 2023 and 2024. I ended up taking quite a few extra samples at depth to help with modeling in-lake phosphorus. So modeling in-lake phosphorus is the way that I ground truth the estimates that I'm getting from sediment-derived nutrients and sediment-derived nutrient loads from those models. And then I cross-check it with how much accumulation of mass of phosphorus is in the hypolimnetic area. And that was one of the reasons why I was pretty confident. I go back to the other screen for a second. That even though you had potentially up to 30% of the internal load of the total load, and it was high in several years, I don't know if all of that internal load should be considered available. So that's why sometimes in stratified lakes, people will use an entrainment factor where it's like 40% of the hypolimnetic phosphorus ends up making its way to the surface. Instead, I used, for now, my estimates of in-lake hypolimnetic phosphorus increase in terms of kilograms. And so that's there. But that basically is the 20%, and then the high range is if I use this average here, which is about 30%. So there's where your range comes in.
And if I could ask, or just make sure I understand it in my mind, that total phosphorus amount, the kilograms, you're looking at the whole water column.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, any depth you took a sample, you
Yes. But I also
extrapolate the total amount of phosphorus.
Yeah. But I'm also modeling the total amount of phosphorus in depths that I didn't have samples for based on the concentrations of samples above and below them. So like in situations where I took more sample depths, that increases the accuracy of the TP in lake mass model.
Okay.
The septic loads were very similar to what was estimated in 2015, a slightly higher load, but it wasn't enough to make it a larger percentage very much. Geese, I think, are more of a problem than was let on in the 2015 report. It's not something that is in the watershed-based plan model, but I counted 115 geese there at one point. And that could be a huge load. And granted, I don't think that the birds are there 100% of the time, so I estimated that they're 40% of the time. And that's where I came in at the 9.2 kilograms here. And that can change, obviously, based on common year actually there. But your low estimate is going to be around probably 4 kilograms, which was on par with what was estimated in the 2015 report, and then possibly as high as about 9.2. So I do think that controlling geese is going to be important for you guys, which is not something I usually say.
Mhm.
And then, what else do you want to see here?
How did you
Mm,
downs these relative contributions from the different sources compare to other lakes our size you've studied?
Normally in lakes that are more developed and have more roads and more parcels and like smaller parcel sizes, those are usually a higher percentage of either low or medium or high density residential. Therefore, they will have a greater phosphorus runoff coefficient than forested area. I did a background model just to sort of estimate if the whole lake was forested, what would the annual load be? And I came up with about 24 kilograms, which was about estimated to be about 30% of the watershed load. So that basically means that even if the lake was forested, you're still going to have nutrients coming from the watershed that have to be factored into the total. And the watershed-based planning tool model estimated that about 14.5 kilograms were from developed lands. That model was really interesting because that's the one that the watershed-based plans that have all been accepted use. But it's a really simple model, and it doesn't have the septic systems, which is why I had to do that. It doesn't have internal loading, so that's all separate, and it doesn't have atmospheric deposition or waterfall. So it's like it has these shortcomings, and it's strictly for watershed load based on land use areas that it's calculated here. I have an email into the DEP currently asking what their turnaround time is going to be like for approving a watershed-based draft plan. And I don't have that answer for you guys yet, but I'm expecting it to be a few months at least.
That's kind of what we heard a year or two ago when
Yeah.
we approached them on our grant.
So Hillary, sorry, the drought had in 2022 had nothing to do with anything, or that did have something to do with the sides, or possibly the heat. You did say that it
I think the heat definitely did. And the thing about internal load is that it's the percentage here is based on the total average load. So if you have a drought situation and you've got very little water coming in from the watershed, the automatic internal load is going to be a higher percentage of the total for that year. The other thing to understand with internal load is that it happens all in the summer, as opposed to the watershed load percentages. The majority of it is going to be like when there's high water flows in the spring. And so having cyanobacteria able to readily use those nutrients from the internal load in the summer also predisposes lakes for it's an overall lower mass on an annual basis, but it is more impactful for phytoplankton and cyanobacteria growth. The internal load is.
Okay.
And the other thing to think about too is that a lot of your watershed sources are coming in the form of like partially decomposed organic matter, or they're coming in attached to sediment particles, which is not immediately bioavailable to use those nutrients, for algae to use those nutrients. But the internal load is all dissolved phosphate. And so that soluble reactive phosphorus is going to be immediately used by cyanobacteria if it can get its hands on it.
Hillary, I noticed you're sharing right now nitrogen, which is something we've never really sampled for. What did you think of what you're seeing for the total nitrogen numbers?
So this is really high, the nitrogen. It's not unexpected based on the increase in phosphorus here, but nitrogen is also recycled annually from the sediments. A lot of times in an anoxic area, I see a dramatic increase in total ammonia, and that makes up the majority of the total nitrogen that you see. Ammonia is readily used by cyanobacteria and other phytoplankton as well. In a lot of cases, I've seen it's actually the total ammonia that corresponds with bad microcystis blooms, because microcystis is not a nitrogen fixing type of cyanobacteria. So we talk about phosphorus because generally lakes are phosphorus limited in most cases, but in situations where there's ample nitrogen and ample phosphorus, sometimes there can be points where it'll tip back into a nitrogen limited system.
I'm blown away
And
by the range of nitrogen you're showing there. That's unbelievable.
yeah, yep, it's very high.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's the bottom sample there. So that's like as you
Yeah,
go through the
yeah,
season.
yeah.
It's definitely not quite as high as you get into the metalimnion and epilimnion. And it didn't seem that there was a pattern directly, like the total nitrogen increase in the hypolimnion was not like linearly related to the increase in the rest of the water column.
Yeah.
That's the ammonia, top and bottom there. There's a bunch of other figures I haven't put on here to share with you guys yet, but they will all be in the report. This was the farm pond stormwater inflows, total phosphorus concentrations from the stormwater sampling sites. Overall, your median and mean were 84 and 191 micrograms per liter of phosphorus, total phosphorus.
Is the data points there an averaging of the different sampling points or the different sampling points
The points
shown?
from the stormwater samples are all on here.
So you
the
averaged for a date?
no, each one of these is a site.
Yes, we have 6
that was
sites.
identified by the volunteers. Yeah.
Can you tell us which is which? What
6
site?
is the 6 is the pipe, right? I think it is.
I didn't see the x-axis. Okay, now I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can make it bigger, sorry.
Thank you. Now I can see it.
Yeah.
And what's the floor?
Where was the street pipe, the storm drain?
That's 6.
I have to open it up.
I think that's 6.
I have the map.
That's the lowest.
It's 6, yeah.
Yeah. But basically this verifies like if you had any serious hotspots in the watershed, like this really high value here, that was severe erosion coming off of failure to control erosion on site during the construction process. I'm pretty sure that's what number 4 was here.
And actually that
like
the high one for SW6 is probably the same thing. That was probably when they were getting all that erosion from the house on the
Well,
hill.
2020, I think that was more of a 2023 one. 2024 was not, there wasn't the construction going on in 2024, was there? I didn't think so. I thought there was
Actually, that was the year where one of the driveways was repaved.
2023. Yeah.
No, 24. The most recent summer.
Okay.
there was definitely runoff in 2024. Like I took a lot of photos of that site.
Okay.
I think I sent some to Tom at one point or somebody at one point because you were going to go back and talk to the Conservation Commission to try to get them to control it better. Yeah, so these numbers I'm going to use to then just verify that the runoff coefficients from your road runoff make sense in the model. This is interesting because, so this is chlorophyll in micrograms per liter here. And this was an extra sensor that I added on in 2024. This uses, instead of filtered chlorophyll, it uses fluorometry, which is a reflectance instead of an absorption. So what it's measuring here is an estimate of the micrograms per liter of chlorophyll based on a relative fluorescence unit. The thing that I want you guys to see is that basically your increases here are all at the top, around the top of the thermocline here. And this was a huge dramatic increase in a very, very narrow, thin layer of serratium that were producing this really high chlorophyll value at 7 meters deep. Yeah, 7 meters there. It's actually 6.8 meters. I remember because I was,
Hillary,
like I took a lot of depth there.
what did you think of the general baseline trend of the chlorophyll? How are those levels? I assume they just from this quite low. Are we nice and low for chlorophyll in the well?
You're very low, like
yeah.
to the point where like the open water surface samples were so low on most occasions that I don't think they're obviously scientifically comparable, but they're like what I would consider on the low end of like accuracy and detection limits for how accurate it is. So like anything under 2 micrograms per liter in the surface waters is like very, very low. You had fairly excellent clarity for, here we go back up to the Secchi here, for both seasons.
Yeah,
which was
last year
interesting
in
because
particular, I thought was good.
Yeah, and what I found was that the Secchi disc, it disappeared like right as you hit that level of deep water phytoplankton. So the water clarity in the surface waters wasn't necessarily like decreasing linearly as you go deeper with the Secchi disc. It's you hit that depth where there's a hovering layer of phytoplankton and then it disappears, if that makes sense. So like, it's not in those situations, Secchi disc clarity doesn't necessarily equate to total phosphorus and or chlorophyll A in that relationship with the trophic state index as well, because you have these deep water layers that are obscuring clarity at depth. And if that layer wasn't there, you probably would have had like Secchi penetration further into the water column. So you can also see this is all the 2016 to 2024 clarity
We
depth.
will never forget that year.
Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of your likelihood to have another bloom like that, I would say it's pretty likely. Like given the right environmental conditions, it's definitely possible for you to have another bloom. The phosphorus concentrations in the deep water area are very high and high enough that it's interacting with thermocline on some extent. And then if you have a year with worse anoxia like you did in 2022, then that's a positive feedback loop that increases the area of internal release, increasing phosphorus and also potentially increasing the availability for cyanobacteria. So that's a lot of information. The good news is in terms of managing phosphorus, internal load is easier and, in my opinion, a little bit cheaper than doing watershed management alone. In Massachusetts, it's been used at a lot of lakes, and the shape and the depth and the flushing rate of Farm Pond make it so that it is possibly going to be effective for up to 20 years if you were to address it with some type of phosphate binder.
Can you say more about that? What's a phosphate binder?
Binder.
Sure. So a compound that could be applied to the hypolinitic zone that would bind available phosphorus, so about available phosphate. the products that have been historically used in Massachusetts are mostly alum or aluminum sulfate with buffering sodium aluminate, or there are products that are lanthanum based. Modified bentonite clay phoslock products are more costly, but it's more of a stable bond with the lanthanum than the aluminum, which tends to be like, I think only a maximum of 20-year lifespan for those kind of bonds. But there's also polyaluminum chloride, which is an aluminum bond, but it doesn't introduce the sulfate into the water column, which is a little bit more expensive than alum. I have like a lot of information on that I'm planning on giving you guys. So this is, well, I'm not expecting you to hear this all out now.
Are you going to provide some simple estimates of potential costs, or?
Yeah.
So, Hillary, would you just, sorry, going up like high level, were we just lucky the past 2 years that we had great water quality and it was just the problems lurking? You can sort of see it below the surface, but I mean, it was great depth this past year, like the Seki depth, right? I mean, I thought the water was incredible. The year before it was a little cloud. I thought it was a little cloudier, but we still got good depths. Like you saw 6 and 7 meters, right? Both years, where we had seen one, in 2022. So is it just it's luck of the draw when that chain reaction sort of starts to happen, right? Or itself, I mean, or
yeah, so it looks like it's going to be set off by a combination of weather events that make the anoxia worse and the potential internal load worse and more readily used by cyanobacteria. And then as soon as the cyanobacteria are better able to use those nutrients, it creates a positive feedback loop, and it'll dominate the water column and basically shade out every other type of phytoplankton and then make the recycling of nutrients even higher.
And is it cyanobacteria or phytoplankton or both? Like because we when we kept having it tested, the state even came back and said, "You guys are stupid. That's fine. What's the problem?" But we kept saying the water's green, but we didn't ever see like the scum on the top. So was it like who knows what it was, or is it just that it's at lower levels? Like where we were testing, we sampled the whole, right? I mean, we never got high ratings, Tom, as you'll remember.
In 2022?
Yeah.
In 2022, in my estimation, we had like a complete water column bloom. It wasn't so much a surface phenomena,
right.
And that's why the Seki was so low.
But when
Catherine, the only samples we sent to the state were the year before, and actually we sent them to
October.
that lab in Connecticut.
October 2022.
Yeah,
right. No, but then Jeannie, we kind of closed we called in the state in October 2022.
And they from just from our photographs, recommended the pond be closed.
Yeah, I mean, I saw those photographs. Yes. I was like not 100% certain that was cyanobacteria, but like pretty sure.
But the testing showed it wasn't cyan. Is what I'm trying to say, is Tom. It never showed it.
The microscopy work that we showed, that we did, clearly indicated there were some cyanobacteria there.
Right, present.
But we actually didn't send that many samples out for.
But we called anyway when the state finally came in and they did the testing they saw like low percentage of cyanobacteria. But it's luck of the draw and timing, as we know, right? I mean, they swim away from the light, the whole thing. So I don't know.
So it depends on where you take your sample. Let me I think did I share with you guys the slide of like cyanobacteria bloom photos? I have to look for it, and I wasn't prepared to share that right now. But basically,
if you did, it's been a while, so we could use a refresher.
Yeah, let me just if I can pull it up.
I mean, we definitely, it was seen that paint bloom thing, that was the beginning of that. But then the whole water column turned. It
Yeah.
was never on the top. It was just throughout the whole. I
It was
fully agree.
just
Green.
everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why we called you in.
Yeah. I mean, I think that can happen again. I think given the right conditions, like early warm temperatures in June and July, a drought condition to make your internal load potentially worse than it normally is. I think all of those potentially could be factors leading to a bloom scenario
Can I
again.
ask you a related approach to treatment question?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like you can either plan ahead, and we're doing some planning because we invested in this study. You can plan ahead and see that, as you've shown, conditions are ripe for a future bloom. You might get funding and you might do a treatment and then kind of protect yourself for 20, 25 years. Or can you do it another way? Can you have on deck the contractor and say, don't treat unless we call you, and we start seeing the Secchi dis and other parameters going south. Is it worthwhile in the middle of a bloom to do a treatment? And
Okay, you don't want to treat with a product like alum in the middle of a bloom, because when a bloom happens, it changes the pH in the water column. And so that could potentially make the alum treatment less effective, because you have to be able to maintain a stable pH when you do an alum treatment for the bond to react correctly and for it to not be toxic to fish. So if there was a bloom happening and the pH skyrocketed due to extra photosynthesis happening, and then you did an alum treatment, it would be much more difficult to prevent a large pH drop, which could potentially cause a fish kill, and might not work as well because the bond and the precipitation would be different at those pH ranges. So the better option is, when alum treatments are applied, they're typically applied, or any type of phosphate binding treatment can be either applied as a low dose or a high dose, or any dose really. It's that the dosage to potentially take care of all of the internal load is going to be much higher than to take care of some of it. There's also the concept of applying it directly to the whole water column as a way to just bind the phosphate that's available in the water column, as opposed to trying to prevent it from coming out of the sediments, which is usually an earlier season treatment. So there's a lot of nuance in deciding what's most cost effective for your scenario. I think a good scenario would be preventative treatments of the water column. If you start seeing an increase in bottom water total phosphorus and potentially worse than normal, we can set up what a boundary is for normal July anoxia. So if you were to treat before there was a cyanobacteria bloom, if we thought that it might happen, then that would give you a reduced phosphorus in the water column. And I don't think the cyanobacteria would have a chance to grow if you were to treat the whole water column, because it actually kills them too, simply because they don't have any more nutrients.
Hillary, while we're like spiraling down the rabbit hole of treatment, what happens next? So all I know now is that, we can apply the clay, the alum, I'm sure there's a variety of things. You've already mentioned a few. It binds, and that's, with the phosphorus, which was what we want. But then what? I mean, is it like floating around? Does it like clog something else? Like, what are the potential consequences of adding this treatment, having that binding process occur, and then in 20 years, then what? Or has it been studied? Like, I'm just curious what happens down the road.
Yeah. So what happens with any product that you add is it's going to flock and then go to the sediment surface. And any remaining binding sites that exist that make their way to the sediment surface are either going to bind with phosphate coming out of the sediment. If you do a higher dose, that's the goal. Or if there's no more binding sites left, it's just going to be incorporated into the sediment and crystallize over time. So like the initial flock that happens is basically like this like white powdery substance for an alum treatment, fluffy powdery substance, and then it'll sink out of the water column and then be incorporated into the sediment over time. And basically all that does is increase the concentration of aluminum in your sediments and increase the concentration of sulfate in your sediments. In situations where you have a sulfate reduction happening, like in Farm Pond, it's sometimes preferable to use an aluminum, polyaluminum chloride product instead to avoid increasing the sulfate reduction by adding more sulfate to the system. But that is more expensive. So we can talk about pros and cons of those situations.
But doesn't it affect the sediment? The sediment? I mean, I'm hearing like, no? How?
I mean, it will over time, if you treat it, it will increase the concentration of aluminum in the sediment, but no, it's really not going to affect the sediment at all because you're only treating the deep water area. So like there are certain cases where treating shallow water areas are appropriate, but the majority of your internal load is coming from deep water areas and there's no resuspension of those sediments in those deep waters that's going to happen. So it would just stay down there.
Like that center section of the pond that has the deep ravine.
Deep,
Yeah.
the deep
That's what
area. And,
we've always
you
thought.
know, I've run into, and I'm sure Hillary can give us a long list. I mean, there's a lot of lakes in Massachusetts and surrounding states that are much worse shape than Farm Pond that, of course, have had to do this. And I'm certain we could get input from people that monitor those lakes and hear what kind of experiences they've had.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk to other lake groups just to get a feel for it, that's great. I think at this point, it's an option. I'm not like flat out recommending it at this point because you do have the situation where you have fairly good water quality for most of the season. And it's only like the rare occasion, as you saw in 2022, that potentially causes those cyanobacteria blooms. So like if you were to do a lower dose than most of the treatments, that might be more cost effective for your community because a high dose in a large area for alum to take care of the entire internal load for 20 years, like that could be like $400,000. And like you don't necessarily need that kind of a treatment versus a lake that was having like constant cyanobacteria blooms. So
yeah,
we can talk about this. A lot of my thought and opinion goes into the report that I'm going to give you guys because there's also things that you should consider. Phosphate binders don't bind ammonia nitrogen. So these high nitrogen concentrations that you're seeing, high ammonia, potentially are going to continue happening even after an alum treatment. And that still could be a driver of phytoplankton in certain cases. So usually the only thing that you can do to fix the ammonia situation is to oxygenate the deep water and to attempt to prevent it from migrating from the sediments, which is a whole other aeration and oxygenation. There's so many different techniques, and I'll go over a number of them in the report. But ultimately, in my experience, phosphate binders work much better to control cyanobacteria because and for cost-effective reasons as well. It's very, very challenging to adequately oxygenate or aerate the entire sediment water interface that you need to. It's just very difficult to get that right.
Hillary, we've kept you almost an hour, so I don't want to ask too many questions, but how do you see your work going forward right now? You're in the middle of writing the report. Will you send Catherine and the committee a draft, or will you want to send your draft to Mass DEP to get their comments first, or what kind of are the major steps going forward?
So I would send it to you guys first. I'm going to attempt to have a technical conversation with Mass DEP to sort of walk them through the different model parameters that I chose to add on to their watershed-based plan model that they have for their tool online. And then based on that feedback, I can make initial corrections. And I'd like to have that initial conversation with them before giving it to the advisory committee. But once I can incorporate initial comments, then I'd like the FPAC to review it. And then I think depending upon the timeline that DEP gives us, we can decide if we want to put it out for public comment before or after DEP has like formally accepted it.
By any chance, are you aware that the DEP has a webinar tomorrow morning on new improvements they've made to their watershed-based plan software?
No, I wasn't, but I noticed them because I ran the model twice, one at the end of 2025 and one like a few days ago, and they were different. And I don't like the new version.
I'll send you the email. You might wait if you're free. It's at 9:30, between 9:30 and noon tomorrow is the webinar.
Okay. I shouldn't say I don't like it. It's just I realized that it classified land differently, and I'm not sure it's more accurate for the land use in Farm Pond. It classified a lot of area as moderate density residential instead of low density residential, and then it took away some of the wetlands area and made it developed land because it was on property that looked like they had been like disturbed wetlands. So I'll be very curious to see what they changed and how they classified those land uses. It made a difference of about, I have to do the math in my head. It wasn't much. It was like 10 pounds of phosphorus a year or more difference from now and before.
I thought of one more question. I apologize. What would you recommend this astute group do in the coming years, separate from treatment?
I have a lot of recommendations for watershed management, including potentially managing geese. I have to look into the permitting requirements for managing geese and what Massachusetts allows and doesn't. I'm not familiar with that for Massachusetts.
They
in Connecticut, you
much.
can get a permit to control them. Yeah.
How about on
they
the
might
monitoring?
understand.
How about on the monitoring side?
I am planning to set like water quality targets for you guys that are more stringent than what the watershed-based planning tool has set for lakes like Farm Pond, based on the water quality data from the last few years. And then that will give you a list of early indicators potentially to make you aware that a cyanobacteria bloom would be more likely. So it probably wouldn't happen until August like it did in 2022, but there are things that happen in June and July that you can watch for to potentially predict if it might happen in August. I thought it was possibly going to have a small bloom in 2024, but you made it through because cyanobacteria weren't taking the nutrients Serratium was.
We asked them not to.
And remind me, the organism that you've mentioned many times, you just mentioned that's a zooplankton, or what is it?
No, it's a phytoplankton. It's a dinoflagellate, Serratium.
Serratium. Okay.
Yeah, starts with a C.
Is size-wise, is it in the neighborhood of cyanobacteria, or is it smaller or larger?
The cells are much larger.
So we could see it in a microscope?
Yes, definitely. They're like one of the only phytoplankton that looked like the Eiffel Tower.
Oh, send us a photo if you don't mind.
Yeah. Yeah, they're very distinct.
I'll look for it.
I remember dinoflagellates from 7th grade science with Steve Enos, Catherine. I don't know if you had him.
I not I
I
Mr. G.
remember we had to make a cell and use candy to make the cell.
That sounds right.
It's coming around full circle.
Hillary, I did send one last stormwater sample. There were 4 in 2024. I don't know if you got the results from those.
I might not have added it to the data
Okay.
yet, but I'm pretty sure I got those lab results like last
Because
week or
Caitlin
something.
slid on her stomach underneath the pipes 4 times this year. So yeah. Make sure we get the credit for that. Yeah.
We will.
Yeah. Well,
I
look
know that so well.
Yeah. She did it all this year.
We just need
Okay.
warmer weather for Q1. I mean, we're already coming up to February.
I know that's crazy.
We
Should
need
we
one for March.
continue? Yeah. Do you think we should continue testing or well, oh sorry. So taking a step back, Hillary. So how much work and where are we with money and all that kind of stuff? Where we Jeannie, maybe I needed
We're fine.
We're fine? Okay.
Yeah, we're fine. I haven't billed for a couple things that I said I was going to bill for in January, but it's like a few $1,000s. And then like I have the whole report budget,
Okay.
I believe, still for what I'm working on right now.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Caitlin, we can probably pause on Q1 watershed checks, but we'll hold because it could be something useful to do in the future, right? Because you said there's going to be targets for us to achieve, Hillary, if we were sending stuff off to labs and all that kind of stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
And then I have potentially another public presentation, but we have to decide when that's going to be. Like if it's going to be after the DEP review process or before.
I think depending on timing, it'd be good to have it we know when it's done, but I think it all depends on timing. Like if it's July, no one will be around or whenever. I don't know how long DEP is going to take. Yeah. Let's hope it's not.
Yeah. Ideally, last year, I think you did something in April or May.
Beginning of June.
That was early June. I mean, if you could get everything reviewed by DEP by then, yeah, that would be great before the summer.
Yeah. I don't know how fast Mass DEP is going to be able to get to it, so I'll let you guys know when I talk to them.
Okay.
Okay, but everything's on track. Everything's good. You got a lot of really awesome data, and I'm in the middle of doing some good report work for you guys.
Okay, excellent. Yes, lots of
Thank you.
recommendations, lots of things.
Thank you so much.
I don't think we were surprised by anything that was said, but it's good to hear it. So.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll let you
Alright.
go. I'll be in touch on email, and thank you guys for next meeting. For Farm Pond is next Tuesday, so our regular scheduled meeting. All right.
Okay.
Talk to
Thanks
you
so
later.
much.
Thank you,
Good night,
Hillary.
Very
everybody.
good.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Everybody,
Bye.
take care.
Bye.
Bye.